Hi, and welcome to another episode of Conversations Beyond the Pew. And today we are looking at the overview of Genesis. And you may be going, why study Genesis? Well, have you ever asked the question of why am I here? Is there a God? If there is the God, then what does God do? Why is life so hard? Why do humans screw things up? And it's interesting because we ask those big questions, and Genesis is trying to answer them and is trying to answer, does God exist? Who is God? Why do humans exist? Why do bad things happen? What is humanity's relationship with God? Can God make things better for humanity or not? What is the origin of the Israelite people? How is God present in our daily life? There's all kinds of questions that Genesis is trying to help answer that often go along with the really big questions that humans have. And to think about that, all right, so this is why we're going to look at Genesis, because we are everyday people wrestling with the big questions of life. Why is life hard? We're questioning like drama, like why does there have to be drama? And we recognize that there is chaos, and can we find a little more peace? Can we find belonging? Can we think that, okay, or believe that someone really does have our back? And so as we go through Genesis, to recognize that the book is often trying to answer these questions. And so here's a few things to keep in mind about Genesis. Genesis, the word means origin. It's got 50 chapters and it spans thousands of years, maybe even more, depending upon what we're actually reading. And it certainly spans hundreds of years in being written and thousands of years in storytelling. And that this book is the first book of the Torah meaning instruction, teaching, and that the first 5 books that are known as Torah also are called the Pentateuch, and Penta means 5, and this includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, authorship. All right, so there's a bit here where some have said, oh, it's Moses. Moses must be the author of the Torah, of the Pentateuch. But starting hundreds of years ago, this began to be questioned and it was challenged. And so by the 1800s, we actually get what's called the 4-source theory. And it is one of those things of going, I wonder if. And here's what we can understand about the 4-source theory. The first tradition is J. It's called the Yahwehist tradition. And why you go, well, why is it J instead of Y? Because in German, it gets translated, Yahweh gets translated into Jehovah. And so the Yahwehist tradition is writing probably around the 10th to the 9th century BCE. And we know that Yahweh is shown in the Tetragrammaton, which is the YHWH. Also, that is a great word, Tetragrammaton, if you're ever playing Scrabble or something like that. Then we've got the Elohist tradition, the E tradition, and it comes from Elohim, which gets translated into God. We get the D tradition, the Deuteronomist tradition, and that's produced in the late 7th century BCE. Mostly it's the book of Deuteronomy. And then we get the priestly tradition, which is the end of the Babylonian exile or later. So we're looking at 550 to 450 BCE. It's also important to note that Hebrew probably didn't develop until around the time of King Solomon. So if anything had been written earlier, it would have been written in a different language other than Hebrew. We get these theories of, okay, so maybe this is the tradition that's writing particular pieces of scripture. Sometimes they get overlapped. Sometimes they get put right next to each other. Sometimes we get different stories, and I will point out where the story is kind of the same, We're going to look at the creation story, but we get different writings. We get different authors of the creation stories also in Noah that are kind of easy to see and look at. And so when we're thinking about authorship today, we don't know who the authors are, but it's okay because it doesn't actually take away from the stories that are being told, from the stories that are supposed to help us as we ask the big questions of life. When we're thinking about dating of Genesis, I kind of alluded to a little bit there with the Yahwehist, the J tradition. We're getting 1000 BCE to 900 BCE. And then we get the priestly tradition that's probably the 5th, 4th century. And this makes up the majority of what is being written in Genesis. We get a little bit of E as well. And then D is, for the most part, found in Deuteronomy. Not to say that different books don't pull in different traditions, but to recognize that's kind of what mostly the book is composed of. Looking at language changes. And so to recognize that Genesis, and certainly Genesis through Kings, is written in a more classical Hebrew, whereas when we get later, we get a little bit different type of Hebrew being used, being written. But classical Hebrew is also still being written post-exile, which is post-Babylonian captivity of the 500s. With thinking about Genesis and the way it's broken down, it has 4 basic components. You get the primeval history, which is chapters 1 through 11, and that is all about the earliest times of the world. That is what primeval means. And then we get the Abraham and Sarah saga, we get the Jacob, Rachel, and Leah story, and then we get what's called the Joseph novella, which is chapters 37 through 50. And so we get these 4 basic components, and within those, we get different types of literature. We get poetry and we get prose. And the majority of Genesis is in prose, so we can understand that also being broken down into particular genres, where we have the story genre, the report genre, the genealogy genre, where we just get lists of names. And when we get to those lists, we will talk about why that they are important and what the purpose is and why even understand it or read through it today. And then there is a case to be made that there is a 4th prose genre of family literature. And we get a whole lot of family dynamics with 12 through 36. And maybe we know, even in our own lives, about family dynamics. And so it's kind of like, all right, well, what did that family do? And there are times where the family dynamics make soap operas look easy. Like the reality of people's lives can sometimes be very complicated in families. And so we are going to read through, how did they get through that? How did they navigate when there is betrayal and even cruelty? How do they get on with their lives? So in thinking through all of this, it is all about that there are many volumes of books that have been written trying to help us understand Genesis throughout the centuries. You could even just put it up on Amazon and go, books on Genesis, and the lists are long. Sometimes it's helpful, and at other times we may find it just overwhelming. But it's important to note that all of the different books and commentaries, they're trying to make sense of a document that is supposed to help bring us a deeper understanding of knowledge as we pursue some of the biggest questions around our lives. As we pursue those questions of who we are, who is God, and what is that relationship between us and God? How do we understand God's presence in our everyday kind of lives? And so I hope that as we read through this, that all of us remain curious about the text and we try to dig into what is it trying to convey to the ancient reader and to us today on the big life questions. So I look forward to the next time of us sitting down and talking through, and we're going to look at Genesis 1:1 through 2:4a. And you may be going, 2:4a? That's a weird breakdown of that. And we will discuss that why that is and why that's an odd spot to stop. So, my hope is that if you read through the scripture before the next episode, that you will look at it very closely, that you will make notes of it, of what's interesting, what's odd, and even take note of the questions that it raises. As we go through our time together, may it be blessed, and may we experience more of God's love and peace in our lives. Have a good one.